So hello and thank you for joining us for today's webinar, Student Loan Debt Relief. What do we know? This webinar is brought to you by the Center for Financial Security at the University of Wisconsin-Madison and the Wisconsin Coalition on Student Debt. My name is Hallie Leinhart and I am the Assistant Director of the Center for Financial Security. And just to provide a bit of a rundown on our event today, we will start with a welcome and introduction by Laura Sutherland. She's Administrator of the Division of Trade and Consumer Protection at the Wisconsin Department of Agriculture, Trade and Consumer Protection, and she'll be representing the Wisconsin Coalition on Student Debt today. Next, we'll have some presentations by our three panelists, providing us with state and federal policy strategies for student loan debt, followed by a closer look about what we know about student loan debt in Wisconsin specifically, and then moving into a presentation that explores debt forgiveness. Following the presentation portion, we will move into a facilitated question and answer session with the panelists, and we will end that session with audience questions. So please do feel free to submit questions for that panelist Q&A throughout the webinar. Put those in the chat box located on the right side of your screen. And just a reminder, this webinar is being recorded today. Slides as well as the recording will be available on cfs.wisc.edu within 2 business days. And if you registered for this webinar, you will receive a link to that recording in your inbox in 1 business day. And with that, I will turn it over to Laura to kick off the webinar with some remarks and introduction of the Wisconsin Coalition on Student Debt. Thanks, Laura.
Thanks, Hallie, for that introduction. Good afternoon, everyone. Again, Laura Sutherland. I'm one of the founders and board members of the Wisconsin Coalition on Student Debt. Thank you very much for being here today to talk about these important issues, and thanks again to the Center for Financial Security at the University of Wisconsin for hosting today's event, and to Hallie Leinhart for moderating. I'd like to start with a brief description of the Wisconsin Coalition on Student Debt. The Coalition is a nonprofit organization, and it represents a range of concerned organizations and stakeholders who seek to increase clarity around the key issues of student debt, college affordability, and loan repayment. It's a nonpartisan organization, and it is not an advocacy, but instead we intend to raise awareness of policy insights and promote outreach to improve the borrowing and repayment experience for Wisconsin residents. We have a number of goals to increase understanding among Wisconsin policymakers and stakeholders of beneficial strategies and practices around student debt, to facilitate Wisconsin community-based financial counseling and workshops by working with community groups and financial counseling experts that connect information and resources with the community members who need them, and to foster a greater transparency and dialogue around the challenges and solutions for minimizing and managing student debt in Wisconsin. One of the ways we are working towards these goals is through offering a student loan debt hotline. The current COVID-19 crisis has highlighted the need for student borrowers to have credible sources of information about their student loans. And this is particularly true because borrowers who lack such information can fall victim to fraudulent loan debt relief scams. Ascendium, partnering with the coalition, has put forth their repayment support team and offered a unique toll-free number that allows borrowers to get general information about COVID-19 relief and about where to go to get information about their loans or repayment options based on their specific circumstances. And for folks interested in that number, it is 833-589-0750 and can be found on our website. To foster greater transparency and dialogue around issues of student loan debt, the Coalition has hosted a series of convenings around these issues in partnership with CFS. These convenings have addressed the impacts of COVID on student loan holders. It has addressed the existence and impact of racial disparity in student loan debt and the impact of student debt on the veteran community. And recordings of all those previous convenings can also be found on our website. Today's convening will look at various forms of student debt relief. As I'm sure most of you know, student loan debt has mushroomed to nearly $1.6 trillion, impacting over 44 million people. And with a new federal administration, there's a significant amount of conversation about how best to address this growing problem and crisis. So while student debt is held cross-generationally and by every member of our community, how it impacts those who hold that debt varies widely, and plans about how to provide debt relief can differ depending on the debt holder. Today's convening is designed to discuss the various forms of debt relief the state and federal entities have put forth, and to discuss the effectiveness of the relief being used or proposed on members of our community. And with that, I'll turn it back over to Hallie to introduce our panelists and get the conversation started. Thanks everybody for being here today, and thanks again to our panelists for enlightening us on this important topic.
Thank you so much, Laura. Really appreciate that introduction. And so now, yes, jumping in to our excellent presenters today. We have Jack Porter. He's a policy analyst with the National Governors Association. Thanks for being here, Jack. We have Nick Hillman. He's an associate professor and director of the STAR Lab at University of Wisconsin-Madison. And we have Kat Welbeck, civil rights counsel at the Student Borrower Protection, excuse me, I cannot quite see your title, Kat, because I have it covered up with my screen. Center. The Student Borrower Protection Center, SBPC. And with that, I'm going to go ahead and turn it over to Jack Porter. And you can just let me know, Jack, when you'd like me to forward your slides. Thank you.
Perfect. Well, thanks so much, Hallie and Laura, and hello, everyone. My name is Jack Porter, and I'm a policy analyst at the National Governors Association. Super excited, for the opportunity to be here and to learn more about, the coalition and the work that you all have taken on. I think my portion of the presentation here really is kind of twofold. I'll first kind of, cover some ways that that Congress and the Department of Education have undertaken policy interventions on the issue of student debt in recent months. And then I'll highlight a few different programs that states have implemented in recent years aimed at helping student borrowers. And if I'll have time, I'll kind of tick through a couple of items that I think are still under consideration with this new Congress administration. Next slide, please. Perfect. Okay, so here we just have a short list of items that Congress included in its 5,000 something page omnibus package at the very end of last year. There are plenty of other provisions included in the package that are not on this list here that do have, an impact on the student loan program and on borrowers in a tangential sense. But I think, for instance, it included language aimed at making the free application for federal student aid or the FAFSA easier for applicants to navigate. It also awarded a significant amount of funding to colleges and universities. But here I've tried to just kind of stick to the items that directly impact the loan program or borrowers. And so the first thing that, I'll cover here are changes to the Pell Grant, which is, of course, the primary grant program that the federal government awards to eligible college students. And so the first thing that I'd note here is that the appropriations deal included a $150 increase to the maximum Pell Award. And so now the largest grant, that will be offered to students will total out at $6,495. It's not quite the boost that we saw in the 2009 Recovery Act, I think where the Pell Award was increased by $500, but it's not insignificant either. And so a little bit more grant aid for students will, I think, certainly have an impact on debt. Secondly, the package included changes to the way that Pell Grant eligibility is determined. I should just, say that, when In my preparation for today, and when reading the coverage on the omnibus, I relied a good deal on the write-ups from the National Association for Student Financial Aid Administrators, or NASFA, and they were extremely helpful in getting me up to speed on these sort of technocratic changes that will be taking effect in a few years. And I'm sure that any financial aid administrators on the line, would be able to explain this much better than I could. And so if I screw anything up, too bad. Please write a note in the chat box or something. But without getting too wonky on you, I would just be sure to note that the new approach to the needs analysis will offer students and families a clearer sense of the size of the Pell Grant that they'll be eligible for. And this, I think, have a good benefit for students who are applying and thinking through their college options. So, for example, the eligibility parameters for dependent students are now as follows. Students from a family that makes up to 175% of the federal poverty line, or 225% of the poverty line for single parents, will automatically qualify for a maximum Pell Grant, which again is $6,500. And students whose family makes up to 275% of the poverty line, or 325% for single parents, are guaranteed at least the minimum award, which is $650, or 10% of the maximum award. And so dependent students whose household income falls somewhere in the range of those two will now be able to use what some call a lookup table, meaning that they can apply their individual circumstances on items such as household income and more precisely project the size of their Pell Grant. And so again, I think that might offer an increased level of clarity for students and families and have an impact on debt. The next issue that I would cover here has to do with subsidized loans. This will surely have a direct and calculable impact on the amount of student debt that borrowers take on. It used to be that students who qualify for a subsidized loan would only be eligible for that type of loan for 150% of the time that it would take to complete their program. So for a 4-year bachelor's degree program, that's 6 years. And that eligibility limit was lifted in the December omnibus. And so from now on, students who qualify for a subsidized loan will not see interest on their loan accrue while they are enrolled or during the 6 months grace period after they've left their program. I should also just kind of maybe back up a second and mention that subsidized loans are means tested in the first place. And so these loans are going to borrowers who demonstrate financial need. And so I think that that's something that hasn't gotten a ton of attention that was reached in the omnibus package, but it will definitely have an impact on borrowers. The next thing that I have here is a tax incentive for employers. This was included in the CARES Act and was going to run out at the end of the year, but it's now been extended for 5 years. And this benefit allows employers to contribute up to $5,250 per year to an employee's student loan payments. And that contribution can be made tax-free. So it will not be subject to the payroll or income tax. And then finally here, shifting from action by Congress to the new administration, President Biden directed the Department of Education to continue the pause on monthly payments for federally held student loans through the end of September. Okay, next slide, please. Okay, now to get into some of the ways that states are acting on the issue of student debt. The first approach I'll cover here are so-called borrowers' Bill of Rights laws that have now been enacted in about a dozen states. And personally, I kind of see these laws as twofold. On one hand, they regulate servicers, which of course are the companies that carry out the administrative and customer service role for borrowers. And so borrowers' Bill of Rights laws in a few different ways kind of set a baseline for what's allowable conduct for servicers and also outlines actions for which they can be held liable. And then some of the states that have enacted these have also created licensing regimes as a way to kind of increase scrutiny and regulate servicer activity and practices. Some states have also included language in their borrower Bill of Rights law that mandates servicers evaluate borrowers for an income-driven repayment plan, or IDR, before placing them into the emergency option known as forbearance. And the aim here being to ensure that borrowers exhaust all of their options before entering forbearance, which I think is especially important given that monthly payments in IDR plans can be as low as $0. And kind of the second prong here that I see with these laws, most of them create an Office of Student Loan Ombudsman, which, among a few other things, are required to stay on top of any policy change coming from the federal government that will impact borrowers. But there are also provisions that require the new office to resolve complaints, to help borrowers understand their rights and responsibilities under their loan, and to create educational materials for the public. And so I'll definitely be watching to see how states fulfill these statutory requirements. I think that there are ways to do so in concert with the federal government and with servicers in a meaningful and creative way that will be more than just compliant with what they're required to take on given these new laws. Next slide, please. Perfect. Okay, so here is an example of a loan assistance program in New York known as Get on Your Feet. And in short, under this program, New York State will make 2 years of student loan payments for borrowers who meet an array of eligibility requirements. First, the borrower has to be in an IDR plan for which they would put 10% of their monthly income towards their student loan payment. And then as you can see, this only applies to borrowers who are making $50,000 or less, do not have an advanced degree, and then there are also some pretty substantial nexus requirements, such as they have to live and work in New York, have graduated from a New York high school, completed their post-secondary program in New York, and have also been in the state for at least 12 months prior to applying for the program. But in short, it's a program that tries to help borrowers who recently completed their program get on their feet, so to speak. Next slide, please. So can we go to the next slide? Oh, there we go. All right. Okay. Sorry for the mind-numbing chart here, but these are kind of the eligibility parameters for a handful of the state refinancing programs that are currently on the books. And I should credit the Washington State Institute for Public Policy, who was put in charge of studying the feasibility of a refinancing program for Washington by the state legislature after a proposal that they put forward did not pass. And their report lays out a lot of what you see here in this chart. Eligibility requirements for borrowers such as a level of income, debt to income ratio, credit scores, those kind of parameters are all laid out here. And then I should, before, moving on, just kind of mention that there were, a couple of other state legislatures that considered refinancing programs that ultimately did not pass. And like Washington, they, put together a commission to study the feasibility of implementing a program. And so I would encourage you all, if you're interested in taking a look at those in Maryland and Oregon as well. The final thing I would say before moving on here is that, as I'm sure you all know, the interest rates for student loans are currently at 2.75%, which is relatively low, at least compared to, the 6% rate for undergraduates that we saw as recently as 2009. And, in these reports, I think, that factor of the current interest rate combined with some other significant competition in the private market and concerns about equity have been kind of what I would say are chief among the concerns for implementing a state refinancing program at this stage. Next slide, please. Okay, here we'll just get into a couple of ways that states have leveraged their tax code for borrowers. First, in Maryland, you can see how their program has been implemented and modified from 2017 to 2019. And so in 2017, Maryland did amend its tax code to make borrowers who took out at least $20,000 in student loans and currently have a balance of at least $5,000 to be eligible for a tax credit. And as you can see, priority was given to those with high debt to income ratios, to students who went to a post-secondary institution in Maryland and who did not receive a tax credit in the previous year. And then in the first year of implementation in 2018, Governor Hogan outlined additional priority considerations for those who took a role in certain state agencies. And there in that final box, you can just see that that the state considered a proposal that would have allowed borrowers to deduct the full amount of interest that they paid in student loans over the course of a fiscal year. as long as they did not make more than $100,000. I should mention that legislative proposal did not pass in 2019, but that was just kind of like the next step that they considered in their tax code provisions. Next slide, please. Okay, finally here, we just have a piece of legislation that passed in Connecticut in 2019 that I think is pretty similar to what we saw enacted in December with the omnibus package. And the idea here is, again, to give employers a tax break if they help their employees repay their student loans. And in the case of Connecticut, it's pretty targeted. In order to be eligible, employees must have completed a bachelor's degree in the last 5 years, live and work in Connecticut, and actually they have to also refinance their loan through the state authority. It's an interesting provision, I think. And so a few parameters there as well. I also have up on the slide here just a couple of lines on the interest conveyed by employers in an international survey that the legislature cited in their take-up of this legislation. And then just a quick example of an employer that's going to be benefiting from this provision shortly when it goes into effect in 2022. Next slide, please. Okay, so as far as next steps, I would just keep an eye towards, I think, 2 dates in terms of federal action on student debt. The first is March 14th, which is when unemployment benefits run out under the December omnibus package. And that's kind of been, I think, the target date that congressional Democrats have kind of given themselves for getting their next stimulus package over the finish line to make sure that those benefits don't run out for folks. I'm not a parliamentary expert by any means, but I wouldn't rule out that stimulus might include some more meaningful provisions for higher education. And secondly, as mentioned, September 31st of this year is when student loan payments are set to resume. I think that some advocates see the time frame between now and then as a window to act on the issue of student debt. And one thing, of course, that's under consideration is direct relief, which I know we'll cover here in today's session. But I think that time frame or that date of September 31st might offer a guide too. And that is all from me for now. Thanks again, Hallie and Laura, and I'm looking forward to my colleague's presentation.
Very good. Thanks so much, Jack. And now we will turn it over to Nick Hillman for his presentation.
Great. Thank you, Hallie. And Jack, by my clock, you were like right on 15 minutes. So I will do my best to follow your great example.
No pressure, Nick.
And Nick, feel free to give me the direction to forward your slides as well.
Okay, will do. Thank you. I'm Nick Hillman. I'm an associate professor in the School of Education here at UW-Madison, University of Wisconsin-Madison. I also direct the Student Success Through Applied Research Lab. A lot of the slides that you'll see here in a minute are going to link to some of the resources that we have on our STAR Lab website. So if you're interested in any of this stuff, we can always follow up and you might be able to find some resources that are helpful there. So Hallie, please, we'll go on to the first slide here. The big question to, I think, all of us should be oftentimes, why do students borrow in the first place? And there are many competing answers, many interconnected answers, and oftentimes conflicting ones. And so if you had to pick 4, you might pick these 4. One of the big reasons why students borrow today is because not just tuition is high and rising over time, but also non-tuition expenses, room, board, housing. It's expensive to live, and a lot of the loans that students borrow don't go to pay tuition necessarily, especially in the public sector. They go to pay these non-tuition expenses like rent or childcare, you name it. And so that's important context to know, especially in light of the second bullet, which is that family budgets are constrained, especially now. And there's really good and longstanding evidence that, at least in student borrowing, the probability of borrowing and the amount borrowed is not equal across racial and ethnic groups. In fact, Black students in particular have the highest rate of borrowing and borrow the most. And this is a trend that's been true for some 20 years. I think now a lot more people are being exposed to debt, especially middle income white families. And this interest convergence is fascinating from the politics of student debt. But the big point is that family budgets are constrained. Third bullet, and Jack was getting at this with the federal Pell Grant, the purchasing power of the Pell Grant has not really kept pace with what students need to be able to pay for college and stay enrolled. And that's one big factor here. Additionally, some would argue, especially economists would argue, that the return on investment, the ROI, justifies some debt. You're basically borrowing from your future self. And so if you don't have the money now, it would be even worse if you just didn't go to college at all. It's probably better that you borrow a little bit from your future self in order to be able to have your education now. So it's kind of tricky to think about sometimes, but there are many justifications. The answers to these questions will depend on who you ask. But ultimately, from my vantage point, I've been studying this stuff for several years now, and I'm confident that we know far too little about student loan debt. We have extremely poor data quality. We rely on surveys a lot of times. People ask, how much do you owe? Well, oftentimes people are way off. In fact, sometimes they don't even know they have a loan. And so survey data is tricky to work with. There are transactions every month, transactions of people paying their bills or not paying their bills. And these are all recorded via the National Student Loan Data System, the NSLDS from the US Department of Education. This data is a transactional database to make sure people are, having their loans count when they should count. And it's difficult to access that data. Sometimes you can, but that's a big challenge. Third bullet here is that even when we have debt data, it's not always linked to other really important data like demographics, race, ethnicity, gender, educational attainment, and so on. So we have a really just fragmented data system, difficult to just even collect the data and have good data. The fourth bullet here is a totally different question. How do you disentangle cause and effect? We don't randomly sign people loans, and so it's hard to say that loans and not something else that we missed is causing some sort of an effect. So it's not to say that loans don't have effects, don't get me wrong, but it's hard to disentangle them, hard to isolate them with confidence in a systematic academic way. And finally, ultimately, there's just a wide variation of experiences. There is not an average student loan borrower. And in these next few slides, Hallie, if you advance to the next, we'll start to look at what these averages look like. So here is data from the federal government, and this shows the average federal loan debt per borrower. And I'm sorry if you can't see it, but if you squint at Wisconsin, it should say $31,700 or so. If you advance to the next slide, Hallie, it gives a quick summary of at least Wisconsin's data. We've got about 700,000 borrowers, which is about 1 in 5 adults, $22 billion outstanding, and this averages out to about $31,700 a year. Wisconsin, as you saw on the previous slide, was sort of a lighter blue color. These are darker colors if students have higher averages. And so Wisconsin is about 45th in the US in terms of the average amount borrowed per borrower. And so just for some context, just for some framing, to kind of get a sense that there's a lot of variation, take a quick glance at the chart or the map. State by states differ here. And so on the next slide, we'll look a little bit further beyond the average and get into the distribution of debt. This is the same exact data, except for now, instead of just looking at the average, which falls right in the middle of that, is a sum divided by all the borrowers, we're gonna try to see how many people fall into different sort of bins here. So if you advance to the next slide, we can see, this is hard again to squint, but the dark blue bar here on the left shows what percentage of borrowers in Wisconsin, this is pretty true across all the states, but what percentage of borrowers in Wisconsin hold less than $5,000 in debt? And the answer is 17% of all the borrowers in Wisconsin have less than $5,000. And since they're pretty small loans, less than $5,000, if you sum all those loans up, they account for about 1% of the total, outstanding for the state. And that's what the light blue bar on the right looks like, displays. What we're going to do in the next several slides, so let's take some good coordination here, Hallie. We're going to look at the different the different borrowing bins. So that if you advance to the next slide, we can see now that we're looking at the borrowers who take out between $5,000 and $10,000. And so you can see again, the dark blue accounts for about between 15 and 20% of all borrowers. They account for about 5% of the debt. So if you add those two groups together, you could say 33% of all borrowers in Wisconsin, a third of the borrowers in Wisconsin, carry less than $10,000 in debt. And if you added up all their debt, it's about 5% of the total. So a good share of people have pretty small debts. You probably advance at your leisure, Hallie, over the next couple of slides. Let's get to the bottom slide here, just for the interest of time. And if you advance a couple more here, what we'll do is kind of go up into bins, different debt bins, and you'll be able to see this closer with the files that are shared on the Center for Financial Security website. But we can see at the bottom of the distribution, these are borrowers. These last two bins are borrowers who have $100,000 or more debt. And you can see that the dark blue is pretty small. 5% of all borrowers hold about 30% of debt. And so you have this really, really wide distribution. So averages are very difficult to take seriously, frankly, when talking about student loan debt. It's really about the distribution of debt. There are very many different experiences across this spectrum. Just because somebody has low debt doesn't mean they don't have problems with their debt. Just because somebody has high debt doesn't necessarily mean they have problems with their debt too. And so to complicate this narrative and to really get into the distribution is really important for having sound evidence in the policy debate. So on the next slide, we're going to look a little bit more closely at Wisconsin's trends. This takes the median. So if you lined 100 people up, the 50th person in line is who we're looking at here. So it's trying to account for the fact that if we took the average, we've got a really skewed distribution. So it's trying to take another approach to understanding who's kind of a typical borrower. And in this case, this data comes from a different source. This includes federal and private loans. And this is available publicly through the Federal Reserve Bank of Philadelphia, their Consumer Credit Explorer. But if you look at Wisconsin, for example, the median student loan debt is $17,829 in the most recent data available. So, depending on what data point you pick, you could either say 31,000 is the average, or you could say 17,000 is the median. And those have different effects on sort of informing the public debate. And so if we go to the next slide here, we can see within the state of Wisconsin, the Madison metropolitan area carries some of the highest debt in terms of the median there, about 19,000. In rural, non-metro areas tend to have lower student loan debt. So the point here is that there's just great variation even within states, not just across the states, but even within states by metro areas. And if we advance to the next slide, we can see even more detail about how things vary across the state of Wisconsin in particular. Now, each of these dots represents a county in the US. There are, I think, about 3,200 counties or so. And the darker dots are counties that are located in Wisconsin, all 72. And on the y-axis, the vertical one going up and down here shows the median amount of debt. And it goes from 5,000 up to 10, 20, 25, and 30. And on the horizontal axis, the x-axis there, it goes from 0% up to 35%. That's showing the percentage of borrowers who are in default on their loans. And so not to compete with who is struggling the most with student loan debt, that's not an activity I think we should I don't want to spend time with, but I do know that objectively, students who are in default are struggling with repayment and struggling with their debts. And so what we see here across the country, and especially in Wisconsin, is that places that have low debts tend to also have high default rates. And this is a consistent theme in the academic literature, where having some college but not finishing it, so having debt but no degree, is really a challenge with student loan debt, because a lot of students end up going just for a semester or maybe a year. They accumulated maybe $5,000 or $10,000 in debt, and then they don't have the degree to make an earnings boost in the labor market afterwards. And so in these situations, students can really struggle with relatively small amounts of debt. So the next slide will look at this a little bit more closely, where we can see some summaries across the state of Wisconsin. Overall, the default rate on loans is about 11% based on this data. There are some stark differences with respect to communities of color. These are zip codes around the state that are at least 60% people of color. And you can see that in white communities, highly segregated white communities, that have unequal advantages and benefit from inequality in different ways, have very low default rates, 9% in white communities, 25% in communities of color. This pattern is stark in Wisconsin, one of the biggest gaps in the country, but you see this across all the states. Median defaulted loan in Wisconsin is about $9,000. So earlier I was mentioning how some college but no degree ends up being a real challenge, and you end up with relatively small loans here. In white communities, the median defaulted loan was about $9,700. In communities of color, the median defaulted loan is about $6,400. And so again, still a lot of money, but in terms of thinking about the $31,000 from earlier, or the headlines and news about 6 figures of debt, these aren't the same students that we're talking about right now. So if we go to the next slide, we can look a little bit more closely at default in Wisconsin. This shows individual colleges across the state, what percentage of their borrowers default within 3 years of entering repayment. And if you again squint, I apologize, but the point here is that there are some colleges within the state of Wisconsin that have high default rates. Upwards of 20% of their borrowers are defaulting. And on the x-axis going horizontally, we can see not just the percentage of students, but the actual number of humans. That's such an important part to this entire discussion, that this isn't just data in a spreadsheet. We are talking about people's lives. And if you advance to the next slide, we can see that about 9,300 borrowers default within 3 years. In Wisconsin, at least, about half of those individuals are from our Wisconsin Technical College system. This is a pattern that we see across the country. Wisconsin has a relatively small for-profit market, a pretty big technical college system. Every state's gonna have a different kind of market, but you could probably see similar patterns where it's the tech colleges, community colleges, and for-profits that have relatively short programs, that have relatively low tuition, and students are borrowing relatively small amounts, but defaulting on their loans. And there are probably a number of different reasons that we don't fully understand yet, but important context nonetheless. If we go to the next slide, I'm speeding up a little bit. I hope I'm not going too quickly, but this is stepping back a little bit to think not just about default, but also some of the policies that are designed to help students avoid default. One of the big ones, and Jack mentioned it, was income-driven repayment. Some folks think that this is the solution to all of our problems. Just get everybody into this income-driven repayment plan and tie their monthly payments to their monthly earnings. Make payments of $0 if you have a certain threshold or ratio, and set that on autopilot. And this chart here shows how many people are borrowing. How many people have borrowed and how they're repaying their loans. So if you go to the next one, Hallie, we can see that if these are 100 people in all these squares, about 48 of them are in standard repayment, standard 10-year repayment plan. So less than half of borrowers are repaying through the 10-year standard plan. And they also account on the bottom, you can see, for about a third of outstanding debt. If you go to the next one, we can see the income-driven plans. I don't know, maybe that's about 20 to 30% of borrowers on the top panel there are in those plans. But on the bottom, you can see they hold a lot of the debt. And we could quickly advance to the next 2 slides just to get through this section. But the point here is that different repayment plans are available for different people, and also are driving a lot of the growth that we've been seeing in student loan debt, because we're extending the period of time and interest is accruing on these loans. And this is by design from income-driven repayment plans in order to presumably protect borrowers from default. I'm gonna just go to the next slide here, and I think skip through these and open this up for our later discussion. If you could, Hallie, pause on the next one, maybe one more. Yes, this one. What we're doing here is we're looking at students who have responded, student loan borrowers who have responded to the survey of consumer finances, and it shows in the white dots all of the respondents, and the dots with the black circles around them are Black borrowers, people who identify as Black, who say they have a loan, and it shows how they're concentrated not just on the left side of the distribution, which means that the incomes on the horizontal axis here are largely less than $100,000, but on the vertical axis, we can see how much outstanding debt individuals have. And so we can come back to this, but I think it's really important to get this kind of information out there, even though it's a self-reported survey. But if you advance to the next slide, Hallie, we can see that with, say, $10,000 of cancellation, about 30% of Black borrowers would have their debts completely gone. If you move that up to $50,000, it would be about 71% of Black borrowers would have their debts gone. And you can see the same rates for white borrowers. If you had an income threshold on there, say you had to earn less than $150,000, for example, then that's what the gray little bracketed boxes mean. And so the idea is that some degree of targeting is on the table in terms of canceling debt. And if we are truly concerned about closing wealth gaps and wealth inequality, I think that certainly income thresholds should be on the table or could be on the table, but race neutral policies are not going to fix these deeply, deeply unequal racial structures and systems that we have. And so I think the next few slides will go through some policy ideas that we don't have time for. So maybe Hallie, if you just go to the very last slide, I will stop. And we can come back to these maybe during the Q&A, but an idea of how we can really, really put borrowers in the center and support them in all different policy responses, not just about subsidies and not just about consumer protections, but really a wide encompassing array of policy actions to truly help borrowers and fix the system that is so fundamentally broken in many ways. So thank you.
Well, thanks so much, Nick. And you will definitely have a chance to talk through some of those things that you so graciously sped up there at the end. But I did want to ask one thing. So on those, thanks so much for contextualizing and by using Wisconsin as kind of the state of subject. If people go to some of those links that you provided, can they find their state of residence and delve a little deeper?
Well, thanks for asking. Yes, I think most of those links will, and certainly reach out anytime, and I'm happy to follow up and be a resource for folks who are interested in this. And Jack, you got me on the 15 minutes. Good job there.
Okay, excellent job. And so now, and we will have time to, like Nick said, delve in a little bit deeper during the panelist discussion too. And now I would like to turn it over to Kat Welbeck, and looking forward to hearing about student loan debt relief and what do we know from her perspective. And Kat, please do feel free to give me the command when you'd like to forward. Thank you.
Perfect. Thanks so much. Hi, and good afternoon, everyone. I just really want to start by thanking Laura, Hallie, the Center for Financial Security, and the Wisconsin Coalition on Student Debt for the opportunity to present. During today's panel, I'm Kat Welbeck, Civil Rights Counsel at the Student Borrower Protection Center. Yes, I know, Hallie, earlier it's a bit of a mouthful. And as you can see here, we're a national nonprofit organization solely focused on alleviating the burdens of student debt for the 45 million people in this country of student loans. So we engage in a mix of advocacy, policymaking, and litigation strategy to rein in industry abuses, protect borrowers' rights, and advance economic opportunity for the next generation of students. And specifically in my role, the SBPC, I work to examine the student debt crisis through a lens of equity and economic justice. So I'm super excited to follow behind both Jack and Nick to speak with you all a little bit about student debt cancellation, and especially the equity case for debt cancellation. And Hallie, I'm sorry, I skipped through my first slide, so we can probably go to, I think, what's the third slide? Yep, that's perfect. And so as you can see here, student loan debt is the second largest class of consumer debt. And I know that Laura touched on this a bit earlier when she opened the programming, but I really think it's worth repeating that. Again, we have 45 million Americans who owe a collective $1.7 trillion in student debt, and it's growing daily. And so again, this makes student loan debt the second largest class of consumer debt outside of mortgages. And so we really have to think about the ripple effects of this crisis and how it reverberates across our communities and especially our economy. And, you know, especially as we're thinking now about how the country grapples with another economic crisis before millions of families even really recovered from the last one, student debt really threatens to exacerbate this ongoing fallout from the pandemic. And so, you know, we're told that education is a tool for social mobility, but we've seen time and time again, the student debt crisis is really hampering economic opportunity for millions of borrowers. And so when we're thinking about debt cancellation, thinking about it as a means to provide much needed stimulus to help all Americans during the pandemic and also advance equity goals. So what I plan to talk a little bit about today is really kind of, you know, spell out how dire this crisis is, how it's affecting borrowers, particularly some of the racial disparities in this crisis, and then really just talking about how debt cancellation can really be a tool for advancing racial equity. And so on the next slide, I just really wanted to point out again, understanding how student debt hampers economic progress for individuals and communities more broadly. This chart shows a bit of research from the SBPC and Credit Builders Alliance that highlights what we call the secret price of student loan debt that borrowers pay for common consumer credit products like mortgages, auto loans, and credit cards. And so based on an analysis of consumer credit records provided by Experian, what the report really did was just show how student debt can affect borrowers' experiences with other consumer financial products. So what we see is that the true cost of this debt, it extends far beyond, just a monthly student loan bill, with borrowers potentially facing tens of thousands of dollars in extra costs when they're buying a house, when they're purchasing a car, or even just using their credit card, because we know that just the amount of credit utilization affects a borrower's credit score, so those with significant debt balances might be adversely affected. And then on the next slide, similarly, adding to that is just mounting evidence, as you can see here, that shows the ripple effects of student debt are substantial. So it just has far-reaching effects on borrowers, again, hindering their ability to save for retirement, to buy a home. Even we're seeing patterns in terms of family formation and borrowers, foregoing, starting a business or different forms of entrepreneurship. And so it's not just an individual crisis, but it's also affecting our local communities and our economy. And so what we see is how student debt really seems to be casting the shadow over economic progress. And so it's really important that we're having this conversation about how student debt fuels economic, gender, and racial inequality. And it also inhibits asset accumulation, it accelerates wealth gaps, and it's really carving out these divides. And so here on the next slide, I'm going to just start talking a little bit about racial disparities. It was really awesome that Nick kind of gave us a head start really talking about these disparities that we see for borrowers and communities of color. And so I think as we talk about and look to create a more equitable and just economy, we can't overlook the longstanding effects of discriminatory economic policy and how our student debt crisis is a direct reflection of and continues to perpetuate systemic barriers and racial discrimination. And so it's all really interwoven. And that's kind of what you're seeing here in this chart. It's all one. And so I like to start off by talking about the racial wealth gap, because I think it helps to show how this divide can really become intergenerational. So you have Black and Latino borrowers who are starting off with less household or familial wealth, and then are taking on more loans to pay for school. They then leave school with more debt, and then that cuts into opportunities for wealth creation over their lifetime. And so then we see when their children go to college, that cycle often repeats. And so I'm going to just go through that a little bit more in the next set of slides, just kind of break it down one by one. And so in the next one, we see in terms of the average parental contribution. And so to start, so we have approximately 90% of Black students and 72% of Latino students take on debt to pay for college in comparison to 66% of their white peers. And a lot of the reason why we see that is because, Black and Latino students are less likely to draw on familial wealth to pay for college. And so that results in a need to borrow more to actually pay for school. And so in the next slide, you'll see, and so how does that play out? As an example, in the next slide, you'll see that across all school types, Black borrowers are more likely to graduate with more debt. So again, less familial wealth, the need to borrow more money to take on to pay for school, and then again graduating with more debt. And then similarly, just also another chart just showing on the next slide that the highest and fastest growing student debt balances, again, are in majority Black zip codes. So really seeing these disparities in terms of who's taking out debt, who has these balances. In addition to higher balances, on the next slide, there's also hardship in repayment. And so we see that Black and Latino borrowers, and especially women, face unique hardships in repayment. So what we see is that 20 years after graduating from college, the median Black borrower still owes 95% of his or her original student debt balance. And when we compare that to the median white borrower, who's paid down almost 95% of their original balance, so a really big gap there in terms of who's actually making progress towards paying down their loans. And then similarly, research has shown that 12 years after beginning college, the median Latino borrower still owes 83% of his or her original balance compared to the median white borrower who's paid down nearly half of his original balance. And then as we get ready for in the next slide, just talking a little bit about default. So in addition to, struggles in repayment, we also see disparities in terms of who's defaulting. And so you see two side-by-side charts here in the 10 most segregated cities in the country, just looking at, again, across the board in majority minority zip codes, much higher rates of borrowing in comparison to majority white zip codes. And then similarly on the other end, even more stark are the gaps in default disparities in terms of seeing majority minority zip codes having very high default levels in comparison to the majority white zip codes. And so just like some examples, within 6 years of starting school, 1 in 3 Black borrowers and 1 in 5 Latino borrowers had defaulted on a student loan compared to 1 in 10 white borrowers. And then across American cities, again, as we see, is that we see these really stark disparities where borrowers in racially segregated communities, predominantly Black and Latino communities, are significantly more likely to fall behind on the student loan and to default on student loan than borrowers in white areas. And so what we really see is that how dire this crisis is for borrowers who fall into default, because default comes with many negative consequences. So when we're talking about these wealth disparities, when we're talking about student debt and wealth stripping contributing to the racial wealth gap, we have to think about the ways that these default disparities also continue to harm communities. When we think about borrowers who default because of the credit reporting, may struggle to find a job, to rent a home, or to even maintain a professional license, on top of the potential for having wages garnished, tax refunds withheld, and Social Security benefits offset. And so to address racial and economic injustice head on, we have to think about the ways to protect student loan borrowers, especially with these racial disparities in mind. And so, as I said earlier, when we talk about the racial disparities in these crises, they haven't happened in a vacuum. They're a result of and continue to exacerbate systemic discrimination. And so I think we must think of both the student debt crisis in terms of consumer protection, but also a civil rights issue, a civil rights crisis, and really think about how debt cancellation can be a means to narrow the racial wealth gap. And so I think, one, we have to recognize cancellation at the levels proposed is a necessary and critical first step to advance racial equity and restore economic justice. And I think with the few minutes that I have left is also, and I think we can probably talk about this a bit more in the discussion, is just talking about there are also the existing programs for student loan borrowers in terms of cancellation that haven't necessarily been used to the fullest potential, or thinking about ways in which our system is broken and talking about what, in addition to the potential for congressional or administrative action to cancel debt, also thinking about the programs that Congress has previously established to provide borrowers with relief, and thinking about how can we ensure that these safety valves that were established by law are operating at their intended function. And so recently, the SPPC published a compendium about delivering debt relief for student loan borrowers. And so both making the equity case for cancellation and speaking to the importance of fixing broken programs that already exist that were created to provide relief. And I'm happy to share that link a little bit later. But Congress already intended for tens of millions of borrowers to receive relief. But that system we see isn't quite working. We know that lawmakers have promised relief for borrowers who were defrauded by predatory schools. We know that borrowers were guaranteed a clean slate for financial hardship that span decades, or even thinking about those who commit their careers to public service in our local communities who have been promised relief through PSLF, but seeing that extremely low percentages and rates of those borrowers who thought they were deemed eligible for relief haven't received relief. Or even thinking about borrowers who were told when there were forces completely out of their control, like an unexpected school closure or the onset of a permanent disability would receive relief. We see that those programs haven't met their full potential. So even thinking about debt cancellation in those lenses, but I think I'm getting close to my time. So with that, I just want to thank you all so much. And I'm just really looking forward to continuing this conversation.
Very good. So thanks so much, Kat. And I do invite the other two panelists to turn on their webcams now. It sounds like we have quite a bit to discuss with all of the information that you three provided in your presentations. I thank you so much for all of that. You really set us up for, I think, a really good panel discussion. So I'm going to kick things off. I have some questions queued up, and the format that I'll use is I'm going to direct a particular question to a presenter. I will call you by name, and then I will kind of open up the floor to the other two presenters. Feel free to jump in with your thoughts as well. So first off, you all spoke about this, about the income-based repayment plans, or I think there's also a different kind of acronym or a different way that that's characterized, but basically payment plans that are repayment plans based on your income. And so how are those, and I think you all kind of got at this, but I'm gonna ask it again. So are those sufficient to address the issue of crippling student debt? And perhaps there is some improvements, some improved execution of those plans that could be made. So why or why not? And so first, I think I'm gonna start off with Jack, and then I know that Kat and Nick both talked about this as well. So I'll throw this to Jack first. You've had a little bit more time to rest your voice.
Yes, thank you. Is it sufficient if significant improvements are made? I think that, you know, if is doing a lot of work there. You know, we're in a system right now where 1 million borrowers default every year. And, you know, just, I think, you know, technically speaking, like, I think that the annual recertification requirements have been proven to be something that specifically trips up borrowers when it comes to the income-driven repayment plan. And I would just, you know, maybe mention a state program in Colorado that directed state agencies to make employees of state agencies and of 501c3 organizations aware of income-driven repayment. And so there's definitely some benefit to improving the program, but as is, no, I wouldn't say it's sufficient. But I'll open it up to Kat and Nick.
I don't know how we want to jump in, but I was definitely nodding along to your big if, Jack. I think agree. I think if, you know, IDR is the best that we can do under the current situation, I think we would definitely have to think of some big fixes, because I think anyone who's ever had to pay for, you know, child care or a medical expense or just a mortgage knows that an IDR payment isn't necessarily affordable. And so just even one thing, even thinking about operating within the terms of the existing system is even re-examining how we define affordability by looking at what people's actual costs are, like what people's actual costs are. So not just sticking with how that was determined like 25 plus years ago. And so when we think about one of the only meaningful changes to IDR since its creation over 25 years ago was to make it more affordable. So changing from 15% of discretionary income to 10% for new borrowers. And even still, that's pretty limited and doesn't necessarily solve the problem. But I think, you know, if we think about that, we're like, that means there's precedent to make positive changes. And so I think that we definitely can and must do a lot more. And if a global pandemic and the economic fallout that's followed doesn't warrant that, I'm not quite sure what would. But I definitely think that's something we have to work on if we want to get it right.
Yeah, I think that I'm on the same page. I would add a technical detail that people might find interesting, and then maybe like a big picture detail, just to kind of think broadly about this. So the technical side of things is that an income-driven repayment plan is tied not to your weekly earnings, but it's your annual earnings from a year prior. And so there are some technical fixes that might be worth considering to basically tie your weekly income through the IRS records directly to your loan payment. And there could be some advantages to this in terms of, you know, making the payments really responsive to the life cycle of life. But on the other hand, the big picture to this is this was exactly the kind of model that Milton Friedman proposed in the 1950s. Before the first student loan was ever, you know, the modern student loan was defaulted on. Before the 1965 Higher Education Act, you had Chicago school economists saying, well, we should basically charge students for how much education they consume, and then just have them pay a portion of that consumption based off their earnings in the future. It's basically the same thing. And so I guess I raised that point because I would imagine that if we accept this reality that there has to be loans, and I'm not saying we have to accept that reality, but if we are going to accept that reality, I would bet that most of us would probably say, they should probably be connected to your earnings. So it's just this big conflict, a philosophical conflict, a technical conflict, but it's just it is just tricky. And so I just wanted to add those two pieces of the puzzle.
Yes, that adds a dimension, I think, for everyone to ponder. So I'm going to ask a question around what probably is on the minds of some, I would say, and that's around kind of this fairness issue when we talk about loan forgiveness and how to think about policy in that. So in terms of how that could occur, what do you feel like, based on research and the knowledge that you have, which loans should be forgiven, or whose loans should be forgiven, I should say? Are there some ways that could be done that would be considered more fair? And I'm using air quotes kind of around fair. So for instance, would that be income-based? Could that be veterans, military personnel, people who have been victims of predatory for-profit schools, for instance? And Nick, I'm going to send this one to you, and then to Kat, because I know you both really talked about this quite a bit. And then Jack, feel free to step in after that if you have something to add as well.
The clinical researcher, academic, sort of perfectly objective person here would say, I want the evidence to just tell me what to do. But to imagine that that's how things work is just naive. And so it's obviously going to be political. It's going to be a contest in one way or another. And so from an academic looking at this question, I would say there's just, if you had to take the best academic evidence, I would say the $10,000 cancellation that's currently been debated, I think that sort of across the board seems well defended in the academic research, where a lot of the loans that are defaulted on, a lot of the objectively struggling borrowers have relatively low debts. And so from that vantage point, with the academic hat on, I would say $10,000 across the board there's pretty much consensus there in the academic community. That would be, it would help a third of borrowers, especially those who are in default. But the political side of me thinks, well, I want some of that myself. You know, self-interest is part of this. You have advocacy groups that are pushing for different angles. It's all a matter of these windows of opportunity that are open now. And I hope that when we're through the other side of this, that we don't have a solution that works well for some but not others, and that we can just really figure this one out, because it's going to be a contest if we don't do it across the board for everybody.
And just to follow up on that, I know since I spoke a lot about the racial equity piece a little bit earlier, I also leaned just a little bit more into also some just like existing relief programs. And I know earlier I said I was going to add the link to our debt cancellation paper, so I'll share that too in the chat. But I think that we do have we do have data, we have polling that shows that there is broad support for some level of debt cancellation. So regardless if it's people who've paid their student loan debt or, paid cash for college. I think I talked a little bit earlier just about the broader benefit to our communities when borrowers aren't just, I guess, just hampered down by so much debt. And I just don't think it's necessarily putting, which groups over the other, but also thinking about that, borrowers really do want to pay, but it's just the system has just been so fundamentally broken that they literally can't. And so I think when we think about providing at least some base level of cancellation, just to even control for that, and having a fundamentally broken student loan system. And then also kind of what I maybe rushed through towards the end was just thinking that we also do have a vast majority of borrowers who are entitled to cancellation under existing programs, but just can't access the intended relief because of flaws in the system. So even being able to remove that administrative hurdle actually just saves everyone some time and energy. So I'm just thinking about millions of borrowers who've just been denied access to the very programs and protections that Congress intended to serve as a critical backstop to some of the biggest risk of the student debt system. So whether it's, again, seeing the failure and rejection of 98% of public service workers seeking debt relief when they thought they were promised. We see the failure and denials for borrowers when they were seeking total and permanent disability discharge, or even subsequent seizures of disability benefits or wage garnishment. So like looking at those things, I just think there's also, an argument to be made there. We even already have a system for relief that we're not fully taking advantage of. And then just to really echo, I know, sorry, taking a bit of time, but just really echoing how much this debt burden ripples across communities. And so it's not just about individuals, but also how deeply our communities are affected in the broader ways of this debt burden really reinforces systemic inequities. Just really thinking about that piece. And so I'll stop there before I go on too long.
I think the only thing that I would add here is that, another, maybe proxy along with income, as you mentioned, Hallie, could be targeting relief to debt that was undertaken for an undergraduate degree. Nick can probably tell you offhand just how much of the $1.7 trillion in student debt is incurred for an advanced degree. And I think that that's something that's being had in these policy discussions too, along with income.
Hallie, you just asked too good of a question. I wanted to also just throw out a possibility here that we need good ideas. I feel like a lot of the things I hear are ideas that have been recycled for years or decades. And so good ideas like, how can we make our data infrastructure work smarter? Maybe somebody who's drawing down unemployment insurance benefits can automatically have their loans forgiven somehow. If we can get some data sharing to work across governmental agencies, there could be some technical fixes here, but also your slide that showed the 10 most segregated metro areas, Milwaukee and West Dallas is on there for folks in Wisconsin. And there could be some geographic interventions where we can say, if you live in one of these geographic areas that is highly segregated in certain ways, there could be targeted relief in those respects too. That I would love to hear some of these. In addition to the good ones already on the table, I think we're at an opportunity to really expand some ideas here too.
Great, thanks so much for that input. And I have, oh, Kat looks like she was pointing to say something really just fantastic. So please do.
I'll make it really, really brief. And I just one comment, even in terms on means testing, it's just a really quick note that, especially when we're talking about systemic disparities and racial equity, again, especially for many borrowers of color, income does not necessarily equate to wealth. And so again, we're talking about the racial wealth gap. So really just thinking about, even when people say, well, if there's an income distribution, but for a lot of Black and Latino families who have significantly less wealth than white families, and we think about historically the reasons for that, just making that note. So I'm sorry, I said it would be brief, so I'll stop there.
No, that's great. And Kat, I see that you did in my chat, you put the link to the report. And so we'll make sure to have these made, available to the audience members as well. So I'm going to kind of keep adding to this topic, this question. There's a lot of, I think, fodder for discussion and for continued kind of development of this. But another kind of question on top of this is the question around those who have been able to save for college in preparation, and that's another kind of area that I know there's a lot of discrepancy in terms of racial equity and just the ability for people to save. There's a lot of movement around 529 plans and various other kind of savings plans that I think have been piloted in certain cities starting at birth. And so I guess some of the question is around, is that another area that could be explored, just more robust savings? But then again, how does that play out when you're thinking about people who have a real leg up in terms of their ability to save? Should they have the same debt forgiveness as those who don't? And then just to add another layer, this question came in from an audience member, but I think I'm going to just kind of throw it in there. It also has to do with people who have dependents, so they might have an income that is, not a bad income, but yet they're maybe parents. They are strapped with debt, and they have a lot of family members depending on them. So how do we think about all these factors when it comes to policy, and how we can take all these really kind of individual characteristics into our thinking when we're coming up with strategies to tackle this issue? And so I'm gonna send this back to Nick first. And okay, Nick is looking like he's not excited about this question, but I'm gonna go ahead and give it to him. And then please feel free to jump in, Kat and Jack.
Oh my goodness, that's such a hard question. It's there, we need another week or so to keep discussing this. I think though, I've heard a lot of interest, especially within the field of econ, and like the economists who really center race and racial inequality have discussed the urgency and the need for baby bonds, so as a way to disrupt racial inequality and income and wealth. And so, Hallie, I think to your question, you're making me think about one of the policy solutions that I've heard, and I think has some potential, is this idea of baby bonds, where setting up accounts for, I believe that it would be for young Black children or Black families, but also maybe targeted by income. I don't know the details of how these would work, but I think that that's one solution I hear as a response that would disrupt some of those inequalities that happen at birth.
And maybe I might sound like a broken record, but just really echoing, I think my earlier points are just about whether broad-based cancellation, whether it's administrative, whether it's via Congress. But again, because I think sometimes when we get into these questions about, I think there was a question about someone with dependents, or just thinking about questions, I think it's kind of like my same answer about means testing. I think that's one of the broader benefits to whether broad-based cancellation, whether it's administratively or via Congress. It's just I think it helps with some of those questions of equity. But I'll stop there because I know I've been a
Yeah, I would only, kind of just add on to what Nick and Kat have kind of touched on, and then just maybe, reiterate Kat's point around how income isn't necessarily equal to wealth. That we're not talking about the same things there. And so as far as, savings programs that some states do offer, I consider them, you know, a viable option for some families who are able to do that, but I wouldn't consider it anything close to a silver bullet for issues of equity that we're talking about now.
Okay, so now I have a question around so in addition to, or instead of, or just thinking about different ways that we can tackle this problem, regardless of if forgiveness can occur, what do we need to think about, or what do we need to do in addition to the current debt that is kind of strapped, you know, that so many people are strapped with, in order to prevent this kind of future ballooning of student debt that we're seeing? So we can work on the current issue and hopefully some of the past problems that people are, you know, tackling right now, or really, like I said, strapped with. But what can we do to try to keep this cycle of occurring in the future? You know, if a certain amount of debt is forgiven, great, but what happens if that the cycle continues, if you see what I'm saying? I'm trying to think, does anybody feel really strongly about stepping in to add to this right now?
I'll jump in.
Jack? Perfect.
Yeah, sure. Thank you. So I think one option is, of course, to increase funding for the Pell Grant. One, to make college more affordable in the first place. You know, as Nick's slide earlier on in the presentation showed, the purchasing power of the Pell Grant has declined a significant amount since its peak. I think in the late 1970s, it covers something like 75% of cost of attendance at your average four-year public institution. That's down to less than 30% today. And so if Congress were to make increased investments in grant funding for students, I think that would naturally correlate to less debt taken out for the future.
Matt, do you want to jump in?
I didn't want to, I know I've been talking a lot, so I wanted to give you one other thing is just I want to echo, sorry, I'll just take a slightly different angle, is also thinking about other ways that we're also adding to debt burdens. I know you hear a lot of talk about debt relief for grad students in the cancellation conversation, talking about, you know, who's getting cancellation or who has these high balances. But I also think that should spur a really important conversation about credentials that many people need just for their jobs. And so I really think we could talk more about how a lot of people actually just need a graduate degree just to do their job in their states. And so, you know, when we're thinking about social workers need a master's degree in every state, or many states require librarians to have a master's degree. And so we can think about even many of our frontline workers who are fighting during the pandemic, and, you know, the fact that many need graduate level degrees to be able to have those jobs. And so I think we're demanding more and more from people who are serving in our community. So even thinking about a way in other forms of, you know, spurring the debt crisis, thinking about how, you know, how people who are just trying to serve the communities do their jobs, but we're not meeting the demand to help fund that at the offset with a cost. So just in terms of policy decisions to tackle the idea of credentialization as a barrier to entry for many jobs that could also be driving up debt balances. I know that might have taken us in a slightly different direction, but it's just definitely something I wanted to flag.
This is great, because the way I'm hearing this is that Jack's looking at, like, you gave an example of the student aid response, and Kat, you're getting at this example of like kind of, you didn't say cleaning up the market, but like there's some sort of market kind of pressures here. And I think the other side of this, to kind of balance it all out, to have a nice comprehensive reform, would also be to invest in the institutions where the debt's coming from. So if we know that a lot of people of color, students of color, are going to colleges that don't have the financial resources to fully support that student throughout their degree program, then we could have some federal investment in the institutions that that are serving students of color largely, or institutions that are serving low-income students. In higher education, we don't have an equivalent of Title I funding like we do in K through 12 education, and I think that that would be, you know, a nice kind of complement to the other ideas that are already on the table.
I'm just going to throw one more wrench in here and to build off of Kat's point around some of these occupations that require a graduate degree or credential, or in some cases an occupational license. I just like another kind of quick policy flag. There are some states that revoke an occupational license if a student defaults on their, or if a borrower defaults on their student loan. Just something to kind of flag here again, as far as, you know, when we're talking about someone's ability to repay, if we are taking away their ability to go to work, then I think that that is a policy worth revisiting in some states, is what I would say.
And then to second that, thank you, Jack, for bringing that up. I'm sorry, I was like aggressively nodding my head. I was like, yes. But also to bring it back full circle, just something so important about your presentation, just talking about what states are doing in terms of creating new laws to combat some of the issues we see in the student debt crisis. And like that's one, even states picking up license revocation bills. So I was just so happy you brought it back full circle to your presentation, but that's a really, really great point.
Great. That you guys all kind of, I feel like, added to that in a really good way of answering that from all different perspectives. So thank you for that. And I have a question that's coming in from the audience that's really pretty interesting. And I think this gets at some of what you were saying, Nick, about some much needed cooperation and in terms of the data and just having the full knowledge of what's happening out there. So this person mentioned, when Laura was giving her introduction, she talked about the Ascendium hotline and the ability for people to call in and get some information. But this audience member mentions that they don't have the ability to find out all the educational debts that a student might have. So including federal, state, private, Perkins, institutional loans, et cetera, et cetera. So what could be done, or what is being done to maybe help have better access to all of this information? Is there any kind of cooperation or happening where maybe even you're able to see credit bureaus maybe are even one of those points of access, or one of those areas where you can actually see kind of what debts people have in this space? Is there any cooperation that is occurring, or any ideas around how that could occur? Nick, I'm going to start with you because you're our kind of data guy, and you obviously have a lab dedicated to questions around data and access. So I'm going to send it to you, but then please, Jack and Kat, we value your input as well, of course.
That's a great question, and I'm kind of shaking my head because I don't have the answer. I think that this is really part of the good work of bureaucracy, of our folks in the Department of Education. I know are working on a lot of the background systems to help make sure that the process can be more streamlined. And so be on the lookout for the Next Gen initiative. I think that that's really a piece of this puzzle. I think though that, I think that it just takes a lot of sort of not glamorous work and public policy attention. And so one way that might play out, say in a state like Wisconsin, is that to my knowledge, we don't have an administrative agency devoted solely to trying to connect those dots. I believe that a couple states have done something kind of similar. I think Arkansas has got a pretty cool, basically governance lab where they're trying to connect pieces and parts of different state agency data sets so that they can understand, and not just understand the magnitude of problems, but also find patterns in the data and places to intervene and fix problems. So I guess all that's to say is I could imagine a situation where states like Wisconsin and others could, dedicate resources to connecting those dots, at least getting some of that baseline, not very glamorous stuff in place so that we can really have the sort of safety net there, the background kind of infrastructure to really support and understand the repayment process.
All right, I'll jump in. Yeah, I was going to mention NextGen as well. You know, the initiative at the Department of Education that's, you know, aimed at making repayment an easier and simpler process for borrowers. I think that there are some things on the horizon that will be interesting there. The only other thing that I would, you know, maybe point to offhand is some, you know, a fair amount of research that's been done by Pew Charitable Trusts that kind of identifies the specific pain points where that might allow, you know, state agencies, Department of Education servicers to identify when a borrower, you know, is struggling and when they might go into default or, you know, what have you. And so I think there are ways that, again, like Nick said, are kind of technocratic, but like will be, I think, super meaningful in the system that we have now to help borrowers, you know, have successful repayment.
And then just to piggyback off Nick and Jack, thanks you all for bringing up Ed. So also in terms of the federal space, it just also, one thing even recently that we've done at the SBPC is also write to the CFPB about the about undertaking comprehensive student loan servicing rulemaking, just to have more of a role of supervising and enforcing the market, just like another piece of there's just many ways that the federal government has a role of interacting with the student loan market.
Excellent. So we are coming up kind of towards the end of our webinar. I have many questions coming in from the audience, a lot having to do with kind of some very specific questions around repayment and some policy specific questions. But one question that came in that I think I'm going to kind of end this on is, so since we have this very, as this person put, we have this enormous problem, and I'm assuming that this person probably works at an institute of higher education, perhaps in the area of student loan or student counseling. What is recommended for colleges going forward as they try to provide loan information and guidance for students and families? So thinking about how people at this moment in time who are working directly with students who are thinking about taking on this debt from year to year, or maybe who are just entering into college or leaving college, what is some good information for these students or some guidance that these professionals in the student counseling or the financial aid, what can they, how can they help at this moment in time? Kat, can I start with you on this? And then I think if you, Nick and Jack, would like to add any kind of closing remarks as well, even just some bigger picture kind of takeaways, that would be great. Feel free to do that as well, Kat, and then I will close out the webinar following your last remarks from all three of you.
That's a really great question and a hard one to tackle. I'm trying to think of quite where to start. I was actually trying to think on that for a second. And I think it just really underscores how complex this entire system is for a student loan borrower, because I'm like, where do I start? Is this someone who's working in the public service? Do you immediately tell them to make sure that they're enrolled in the right income-driven repayment plan and they're on track for public service loan forgiveness and they're keeping track of their payments and recertifying every year? And so that's the first track. Or is it, we're in during the CARES Act payment pause right now, making sure that borrowers who are know that they have the payment pause if they're a federal student loan borrower, or if potentially, well, I guess they're new borrowers, so they wouldn't be a fellow borrower, but thinking about what does that mean for their repayment? So I'm struggling thinking about where to start, but there's so many different ways. But I think all of that, and I don't know if this is also a concluding thought, but it's such a complex system, and I think this is why we find so many borrowers struggle with it. And even as someone who does this every day for a job, even me thinking about what I do with my loans, it's still something that's complicated. I have to make sure, hey, like, did I recertify? Did I meet this date? And so I'm sorry if that's not as complete of an answer, but I think it varies by borrower, but I think that again underscores part of the problem with the system, almost where to start.
Gosh, such a good way to end it too. I would make a connection to an earlier point about this whole idea of investing in institutions, the idea of we don't have a Title I in higher education that supports colleges that enroll disproportionate shares of low-income students of color. And so in response to this question, it makes me think that the financial aid officers are asked to do a lot. And that's what our lab does. We work directly with aid administrators to understand the practice so we can help have better research around it. And it is clear to me that financial aid administrators are stretched thin. Students' problems are complex, far, far more complex than what any one person or group could solve on their own. And so I think that to have financial aid offices have the capacity to really do the kind of support and outreach that they need would be an investment. And I think that is what many of this comes down to. So if we want nice things, we have to pay for it. And I think that that is one of the examples that comes to my mind. And maybe is a good way to end with my closing words of wisdom there.
Yeah, I don't know that I could add anything more than that, and especially in terms of investments in institutions on this front. We know that right now they are required to conduct entrance counseling for student loan borrowers and exit counseling for student loan borrowers. I think a lot of the ways that Nick describes people being stretched thin on campus can kind of result in processes that are strictly compliant, and that's because institutions need more resources to do meaningful entrance and exit loans counseling, I think. And so I think that would be one benefit from increased investment in institutions in a way that Nick is talking about.
Okay, very good. On that note, we are wrapping up basically right on schedule, just 1 minute over. And I think that this was just an information-packed session. And so with that, I do want to just thank Jack Porter, Nick Hillman, and Kat Welbeck. You've provided such valuable insights and just a wealth of information in your slides and in your presentations and this discussion today. I want to thank Laura Sutherland and Carol Trone as well with the Wisconsin Coalition on Student Debt. And I want to reiterate that these slides and this recording will be posted and available. That has been a question that I've just been receiving time and time again in the chat boxes. Can I have access to these slides? Because yes, they were just the links that were provided by the presenters, quite valuable. So again, thank you so much for your time. Thanks so much to the audience for tuning in today. And with that, we will conclude, and please have a healthy and safe rest of your week and future. Thanks, everyone.
All righty.